welcome back to another daily dose of history. It has been quite some time since I made a video for you guys, but today that changes. Last week I created a poll on your test consisting of various topics that were left in our history book, and I left it up to you to decide what the next series of videos would be about. And the time has finally come to share those results with you. As you can see on my pie chart here, it was an overwhelming amount of votes, and it was the vote that I secretly hoped that you guys would choose. So, our topic for the next series of videos are the Civil War. No, not that one, though that is where they get their name, and it is an appropriately titled name. No, we're going to be talking about this Civil War instead. The war between fellow Americans in the mid-1800s. So let's get started. So here's how this series is going to work. Including today, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to break up this chapter into 4 parts. In each video, we're going to be breaking down various parts of the war, such as the what, the who, the where, and so on. Today, we're going to be tackling the who and parts of the where of this war. But before we get too deep into this thing, we do need to know some background information, and that just so happens to be the unfortunate why behind this war. If I could, I would spend an entire week of videos breaking down this very topic, but for the sake of time, I'll be brief. As the United States continued to grow in the 1800s, each region became a little more unique and different in their way of life. The northern part of the United States became very industrial and business-oriented, whereas the southern parts of the United States focused on slavery and crop plantations. And the mistreatment of African Americans being used as slaves in the South was unsettling to most everybody except the people that lived in the South. And to add to it, as Americans continued to move west across the United States, the decision whether a new state should allow slavery or not became a pretty big point of contention. A compromise was made between the free and slave states, but just 11 years later, the southern states decided they'd had enough and attacked the northern states on April 12, 1861, at a place called Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. And this was the beginning of the Civil War. Today, we'll be talking about who fought in the Civil War, and it's pretty depressing. There was only one country that fought in it. Us. A civil war, by definition, is a war between citizens of the same country. Now, there's a reason why that Captain America movie was called Civil War. The Avengers were fighting against each other instead of being united fighting against bad guys. And there's a reason why our book tells us that more Americans died in the Civil War than any other war in American history. More than World War I or II, more than the Korean or Vietnam War, and even more than the original war that started it all, the Revolutionary War. And the sole reason why is because as a country, we couldn't find common ground and make a peaceful solution to this issue, therefore causing a war between ourselves. So let's get down to brass taxes then. Besides the obvious, the United States, just who fought in this war? Who were the different sides? Who was in charge of those sides? And what were they fighting for? Let's start with the North. In the North, President Abraham Lincoln asked men to fight to preserve the Union. He meant that he wanted to keep the United States as one country. Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, which freed slaves in the Confederate States not yet under Union control. It made many Northerners feel that they fought for freedom as well as for the Union. This is what Lincoln is most known for, ending slavery in the United States from a legal standpoint. Now, most Southerners still had slaves after this, but at that point they were considered illegal. So not only is the North fighting to keep the whole country united, because, United States of America, they also felt a great sense of pride in fighting for freedom of the slaves. In the meantime, the South was also fighting for freedom, just in a different way. White Southerners also fought to be free from Northern control, since they wanted states to be free to leave the Union. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, also called on Southerners to defend their homeland and way of life. So this Jefferson Davis guy is thinking, hey, the Union has a president, so maybe our states should also have a president, thus making the Confederate States of America. And these guys wanted to keep slaves around because they were getting rich off of all their work. Both sides had reasons for fighting the war, but all these reasons did not draw enough men into the fight. Before the war's end, both sides used an unpopular system, the draft, to fill their armies. In the end, millions of men fought in this conflict, and 752,000 of them died. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of these guys didn't get to choose whether they wanted to fight or not. By using the draft system, each side was able to build up their army to more men than they originally would have had. And the people that were drafted were very different on either side of the war. On the side of the Union, meaning the North, The army was made up of a variety of people. For the most part, they were farmers, but you also had European immigrants and hundreds of thousands of African Americans. In the meantime, the Confederate troops, well, they were just mostly poor and white farmers. As a result, neither side was a legit fighting force. It had been quite some time since the formal fighting days of the US armies, and so they needed some leadership. And a quick side note before we get to that leadership part. Let's talk fashion. To me, this just kind of sums up the ridiculousness of the war. Our text says that the Civil War soldiers got to pick their own uniforms, but then they started shooting at their own teammates on accident, and so they had to change it up to the blue and tan uniforms we normally are used to seeing. But let me say that again slowly. They were shooting at their own team. And I hate to break it to you, but they were going to do that no matter what color they were wearing. They're all Americans. Both sides. They were going to shoot at each other no matter what. Okay, rant over. Let's get back to the leadership that either side needed. Both sides also needed good leaders to command their troops. Many of the nation's skilled generals were Southerners and chose to fight for the Confederacy. The most famous of these expert generals was Robert E. Lee of Virginia. Lee turned down an offer to command the Union armies and eventually took control of the Confederate force. In the North, President Lincoln spent the early years of the war appointing one general after another. He needed someone who could lead the Union armies to victory. A group of people or organization is only as strong as their leader. The South had a very strong leader in Robert E. Lee, and as a result, they won a lot of the battles during the first 2 years of the war. Meanwhile, President Lincoln was having a tough time picking a solid general to lead the Union Army. However, things started to change on September 17, 1862, during the Battle of Antietam in Sharpsburg, Maryland. Then, on September 17, 1862, forces clashed in Sharpsburg, Maryland at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam was the first battle on northern soil, and the battle ended up being the bloodiest day in U.S. military history. More than 23,000 men were left dead by the end. Although neither side defeated the other, it was considered a Union victory because General Lee and his Confederate forces finally retreated. The Battle of Antietam was a turning point in the war since it led to Lincoln issuing his Emancipation Proclamation. Just as Bunker Hill was a moral victory for the Continental Army, despite the heavy losses, the Battle of Antietam was actually a major turning point for the Union. They were able to force the Confederate troops to retreat, and the president was able to declare his Emancipation Proclamation. Yes, there were heavy casualties, and that's bound to happen when you're fighting your fellow countrymen, but the Union finally started to feel like they were succeeding. However, so did General Lee and the Confederates. In 1863, Lee decided that a Confederate victory in the North might convince the Union to ask for peace. In a bold move, he invaded Pennsylvania with most of his army. This bold move took place in the town of Gettysburg, one of the most iconic landscapes of the Civil War, and where I happened to get this cool replica sword. During this fight, Major General George G. Meade took a page out of the book of someone you might know.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
And that actually is a legit battle strategy. When you have the high ground, you are looking down upon your enemy, and they're trying to climb up it, which wastes a lot of energy. And this fighting took place for 2 days until Lee decided to make a bold move. On the third day, Lee decided on a brave gamble. He sent General George Pickett and about 15,000 troops to attack the middle of General Meade's defensive line, where the Union Army was strongest. Yelling and waving flags, Pickett's men crossed 400 yards of open fields before charging up the strip of high ground. This strategy, known as Pickett's Charge, was a massive failure. As a result of it and the Battle of Gettysburg as a whole, the Confederates lost over 1/3 of their entire army, and they were forced back to their home base of Virginia. In addition, Robert E. Lee decided that trying to invade the North wasn't a very good strategy, and so they never did it again during the war, which proved to be a major advantage for the Union. And so guys, that's going to do it for another daily dose of history and the end of part 1 of 4 for our Civil War series. Make sure you're back here on Thursday as we dive into part 2 and discuss the military tactics and the overall conditions of fighting in this war. That's all I have for you today, so I'll see you here on Thursday.